In this video, I would like to offer some reflections, share some reflections on aesthetics as a philosophy of contemplation. And I think this is really important in the times we live in, where the arts have been designated as non-essential activities. And while I understand the thinking behind that conclusion, perhaps it is timely for us to reflect on what are the traditions where arts occupied a completely different place. How do we recognize these traditions and practice them, and what kind of value they can offer to us in the times that we live in. Aesthetics as a contemplative philosophy is very well developed in Indian philosophical thinking, and it reaches its culmination as the Rasa philosophy, which is very much a part of the dance and theatre practices, the temple dance practices in India. Having said that, I do think that today we are at some distance from a lived understanding, a lived perception of what this means, because I think we have the theory and the philosophy, and we have a way of doing it which has changed and evolved as necessary, but somehow that linking, that lived knowing of what that linking is, has been lost. So when we simply make statements that Indian temple dance is contemplative, or to use the other more popular word, that it is spiritual, I'm not sure that we in these times we do really know what does that mean. How does that happen? I think we have to take a few steps back before we get to Rasa philosophy itself. Rasa is, in Indian theatre, is the philosophy of how aesthetics becomes a space of contemplation. What is the relationship of form to aesthetics? What is the relationship of performer to the practice? And what is the relationship of the so-called spectator, or those who participate in this performance ritual, to the practice itself, to the contemplation spaces invoked in the practice? So all of this is the domain of Rasa. In theatre, Rasa focuses on emotion and how emotions become spaces of contemplation. And this is really important too, because we often think of contemplation as an analytical, technical, mental exercise, something to do with a kind of mindful watching of thoughts. So there is a bit of a technique and a way of, that contemplation is a kind of an emotion neutral space. And what Rasa proposes is that it's the opposite is the case. So why does it do that? Supposing we consider reality, supposing there is a experience of reality that is as much emotional as it is material. What does this mean? So this is where the philosophy about gunas, which is part of the Sankhya philosophy. So when I use these names, it is not meant to what shall I say, imprison us. Now here there's another body of knowledge, but it is just to refer to them as the fact that there have been people and traditions that have considered this and have gifted to us certain perceptions and ways of looking at reality that could offer value to us even today. So that is the reason why I refer to them. And my invitation always is to listen from the heart and not get stuck on here's another body of scholarship or another text or something else that needs to be mastered. So Gunas proposes that the universe is informed or is pervaded by or is infused with three drives which are really ultimately emotional. And one is the drive to tamas, which is the drive literally meaning to inertia, but it's more like an inertia of the spirit rather than a literal inertia. So it is where we are so busy constructing our meanings and frameworks and philosophies and narratives, explaining this reality, that we are lost. We are so fragmented, we are so divided, and we are, in other words, we're deluded. We think we know, but the knowing, the stories we have are incongruent or disconnected with reality, and therefore we are actually deluded. And I think to some extent we can look at the times we live in where we have these multiple narratives about our physical, our kind of biological health, the health of our spirit and mental health, the economics, the science, the environment, all of this somehow going along parallel lines, and as you can see, often in conflict. So where we have to somehow make one thing a priority at the cost of other things. So we don't have a unifying narrative. And this is something of what tamas suggests. The next band is rajas, which is really the band of action. But it is action that keeps us very busy. We are motivated to act and keep, to do different things. But we are also attached to the outcomes of that action. So there is attachment here. We are very directed in our action. We want certain things from the action. And when we don't get those things, we are in pain. Or when we get those actions, we are in pleasure. But inevitably, there is pain and pleasure. So we assume a certain control or a certain kind of direct line between what we do and the consequences. We think we have a straight line of vision. And I suppose the reality is that we don't. There might be things that might work, might be some things that work, many things that don't work. But the nature of our mind is to sometimes focus on those that have worked and keep that wishful thinking in all our actions. So that is rajas. And the third is sattvika, which is the drive towards knowledge, and towards gaining intellectual knowledge or spiritual knowledge or whatever it is. And while this on the surface is something that really appeals to our times, the search for information, for knowledge, this seems like a noble pursuit. But that also is tied to comfort. We seek knowledge because we think that knowledge brings us a certain stability and surety and comfort. And so that there is that attachment to comfort there as well. These three emotional kind of bands are inherent in reality. They are not sourced in us. They are in all of life. in all of this movement of reality that we see around us. And so my invitation now is to consider a perception of reality that is shaped by movement and emotion. Movement, and by the movement of these drives, they shape action and they shape form. So we think of the more subtle things coming out of the more kind of material things. But the proposition here is otherwise, that it is these drives, the movement of these emotional drives that shape form and action. And these drives are not separate. They are always in dynamic interplay. So you cannot just be in one of them. Even if you're in sattva, which is the knowledge drive, you are always going to be affected by the movement. They're constantly in dynamic movement all the time. And so it is the movement of these emotional drives that shape action and form. And overlaying or underpinning all of this, and you can see that coming through in different ways in all of these drives. So you have the idea of delusion, you have the idea of attachment to this ambition to do action that gives you pleasure or good things, and then you have the sattva, which is knowledge that brings you a certain stability and comfort. So underpinning all that is what is called karma, which is pleasure. And this drive is the strongest drive in all of life. The drive for pleasure, or karma as it's called, it is so strong. They say that it's stronger than anything else. It's stronger than intellect. It is stronger than everything else, is this drive for pleasure. And it is to say that you can control pleasure, or that you can direct pleasure, or that you can remove pleasure, is proposed as a fallacy. That the wiser way is to inquire into pleasure, is to understand the nature of pleasure, understand how it works, understand the anatomy of pleasure. And through that inquiry, it is through that inquiry that we are able to work with pleasure to live in greater harmony. So rather than opposing pleasure or seeing pleasure as something outside of oneself, as an object, the idea is to kind of come into alignment with pleasure and to inquire into pleasure, and in doing so, to work with pleasure to live a contemplative life, or to live a life that is more aligned to how nature is, or how reality is, which is that it isn't just material, that we are essentially a part of nature. So we and all of nature is more than just about the materiality, that there are these movement and emotions that are an integral part of nature. They don't belong to us, they're not sourced in us, but we are really shaped by them, and we are formed by them, we are moved by them. And so in inquiring into that, we actually are able to understand ourselves, to understand why we do certain things, and to understand how we can act in a way that can bring us into alignment and harmony. So this is where that action band, Rajas, when it aligns with sattva, which is knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge isn't knowledge about the narratives that come from tamas, the narratives of materiality, which are functional and which have their role. But this is about, this inquiry is the knowledge, that which can allow us, that which can give us the information to undertake this inquiry. So when our action aligns with that kind of knowledge, that sattva, then we begin moving towards actions that bring us into harmony with reality. And that by that I mean we don't have these fragmented narratives. We are able to move in a way that finds an alignment with the totality of reality. We don't find that by acting in one way we are not in harmony with something else. For example, by earning a livelihood, then we have to destroy the environment, for example. So, being able to act in a way that brings us into complete alignment. And this is where the arts, aesthetics, offers a really important practice of inquiry. Because what aesthetics or the arts identifies, well, aesthetics is the dynamics of pleasure. What gives us pleasure? Beauty. All of this is aesthetics. Beauty, pleasure. So what brings us pleasure? And it's the dynamics of aesthetics. So no matter what we do, if we are in beauty, we approach it with a loving attention. We approach it with a willingness, not through force, not through brutality, but we approach it with an openness, with a loving attention, with a willingness. And that is the power of aesthetics. When you align yourself with the fact that if pleasure is indeed one of the most primal drives of life, then how do we move in pleasure? Why do we need to reject it? I mean, well, here the proposition is you can't reject it. It would be a fallacy. You would be in delusion if you think you can reject pleasure or you can be in a place where you're not moved by pleasure. So how do we move in pleasure in a way that can be gentle, open, loving? And this is where aesthetics is the dynamics. It's the dynamics of pleasure and beauty. But when we consider aesthetics in this way, there are some important differences between how we might think of arts in our usual ways. So usually we think of arts as a creative practice. We think of it as something, as an expression of the self. We ascribe value to originality. We think that art has to be something that's very individual, and therefore that's something to do about this individual's original vision, and that that there is an expression and that it has to entertain or offer pleasure to people that are watching it or that are consuming it. But I'm going to invite you to consider a few different things about arts or aesthetics in the contemplative space. So what if we can have a movement or a practice of aesthetics that is not about an expression but about a state of being, that is not creative in the sense that it is an interpretation or a reading or an opinion or a vision of something, but it is an alignment, it is a coming into oneness, and it is a unity. It is a movement of unity rather than a telling or an expression or an interpretation. And what if the relationship with anybody who chooses to participate in this movement is not of providing something for them to consume, but simply that they can choose to be in this space if they are seeking that same experience of unity, if they are seeking that same movement of unity. They choose to be in this space, and in that choice, in choosing to come there, they can partake of this same movement, this same state of being that is invoked by this performer, or this performer priest, really, who is invoking this state of being. So maybe I'll just repeat that again. So what if aesthetics or arts is not about a process of creating something, but of becoming a state of being that is not about an interpretation or an expression, but about an alignment, but about a coming into unity? And what if it isn't being offered as something for somebody to consume, to watch, even consuming with the eyes or ears or whatever, but it is about the person coming into that space, being open to be part of this invocation, to participate in this invocation. So you can see that this is a very different perception of aesthetics and arts. And so when we talk about arts as contemplation or aesthetics as contemplation, it is not just a statement that if you say it, then it'll automatically become that. But in the practices and in the traditions, for example in temple dance, where this was the intention, it was a very deliberately, I don't want to say constructed, but a very deliberately organized constellation, which included the state of being of this person who was going to invoke. What was their intention? What were they looking? So they didn't come into it because they wanted to be creative, because they wanted to have a forum to express anything individual, to express particular thing. But they were no different to the priest. In fact, in the Sanskrit word kavi, which is very narrowly defined as poet, but broadly means those who are able to have the capacity for aesthetic expression of invoking this kind of contemplative or spiritual spaces. So that would include the priest, that would include the artist, the singer, whoever was doing it with this intention. So you as a performer, priest, your state of being, your intention was part of this constellation. How this form, the practice, is approached, what is the relationship of the person doing it to the form? It is not about mastery. In fact, the form is the deity, as they say, which means the form is this unity. So the way you approach the form is very different. Your intention is not to master the form, to create a kind of virtuosic mastery of form. That's not your intention. And then what is the relationship between those who are coming to watch the form? And they're called sahridayas, which in Sanskrit means of the same heart as the performer priest, which means their intention, their state of being is almost the same, if not the same, as the person who is invoking, who is, holding this form and invoking the state of being. So they are not there for entertainment, nor are they there to be tortured or bored, or because there is a pleasure. It is absolutely about beauty, about pleasure, but it removes that instrumentality from pleasure. It goes into, I think, the heart of pleasure. It inquires into pleasure, and through that inquiry, it brings that pleasure itself into a very different dimension, into a very different contemplative and unifying dimension. And I think that knowing these practices, recognizing these practices for what they are, is really important in these times, because I think our fear of pleasure, our lack of maturity about pleasure, our lack of perception about what a big role pleasure plays in shaping who we are and our actions, means that we are like children. We think that we are going to somehow ignore this and have all these different things which are about all these other, the whatever it is about, but ultimately they are all about how we find comfort and what brings us pleasure. I have a curious magpie behind me. Ultimately, they're all about what gives us comfort, what brings us pleasure. And maybe we can, in inquiring into pleasure, we can find better ways that still bring us beauty, but can align us better to what is good for all of life. That we don't have to act in ways that separate us from the rest of life, and so therefore what is good for us, what brings us pleasure, has to be destructive to the rest of life. That we might find better ways to align ourselves with the beauty of all of life. And this is where these practices offer us such valuable gifts of inquiry into the anatomy and the movement of pleasure. Thank you.